Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to begin our 220. Is the speaker on? Is it on? Yes, it is. Okay. I'll use my indoor voice or outdoor voice. Okay, outdoor voice. I'd like to thank you for coming today. This is our second panel discussion for today as part of our 9th Annual Academic Symposium. If this is a repeat for some of those who have been through them, please bear with us for some of those who have not been. My name is John Weir. I am Director of the Healthcare Administration Program here at Marian and a member of the Academic Symposium Committee. The members of that committee in alphabetical order are, I know, I'll just go through them quickly and just wave your hand. Dr. Cheryl Ayala, Ms. Terry Drake, she's back there, Mark Heimrel, around here somewhere, Sister Donna Ennis, Dr. Michael Ketterhagen, probably in class, Dr. Aida Mikowski, Dr. Ed Ogle, Pat O'Connor cannot be with us today, and Miss Mary Schweiner, she's probably out by the desk. Okay, thank you very much. A few quick announcements. This session is being recorded, and we will have it posted as soon as we can on the web, out on YouTube, so that you can see it again if there's something you wanted to look at that you missed. We invite you to sign in so we can send you information about the posting of sessions as well as other academic symposium information in the future. Your feedback is very valuable to us. I was on the committee last year, and I can tell you the feedback that we got from last year, we tried to incorporate into this year and to make it a more effective academic symposium. Please fill out the evaluation form and get it to one of the committee members right at the front desk there. And please turn off your electronic devices that will be making sounds. And now, why we're here today, the academic symposium is the university really necessary? Does it need to change? You have on your brochure today's panel members, and they're going to discuss paradigm changes in liberal arts. They're going to discuss liberal arts, and I'll start off with Dr. Szromba. Okay.
All right. I guess we're ready to go. I'm Professor Matthew Szromba.
We are also going to have Dr. Ralph Waginke act as moderator, and he'll help to draw out some additional questions that he thinks maybe have not been answered by the panel. Dr. Szromba.
All right. I'm Professor Matthew Szromba, and I'm an assistant professor here at Marian. I'm an assistant professor at Marian University. The title of our panel discussion today is Paradigm Changes in the Liberal Arts, Next Step. And the first thing I'll point out is that I think that each of our panelists is probably interpreting this theme differently, but that's a good thing. That's what makes panel discussion so interesting and lively. To me, the way I interpreted the title of our panel discussion, it seems to me that none of us here, and that includes the panel and then everyone here in attendance, is really interested in doing away with the university education or doing away with a liberal arts education in the 21st century. We still see a university education and a liberal arts education as sort of relevant and vital in the 21st century. So instead, I think what we're interested in doing is maybe modifying the paradigm, shifting it, changing it, updating the paradigm of liberal arts education in the 21st century, and maybe perhaps moving it forward. So the purpose of my short presentation today is that I think we can update, move forward, modify our paradigm of liberal arts education by changing the language that we use to describe a liberal arts education. I think we need to be deliberate in this process. In other words, we can't just sort of engage in a piecemeal process where we take a look at all kinds of words and phrases and ideas that we use to identify a liberal arts education. We have to be deliberate. That's one thing to point out. And we can't be too ambitious in our goals. Obviously, we can't tackle everything at one time. We'll set an impossible task for ourselves. So the thing that I'd like to suggest today is what I regard as a very modest and very obtainable goal, and it is as follows. Here's our goal. I would suggest that we all should eliminate the phrase well-rounded when used in reference to a liberal arts education. I know on first consideration this may seem like a trifling thing. It may seem like I'm trying to make a comical point here, but it's actually really, really serious. That I think if we closely examine the way we use this term, that is well-rounded in reference to a liberal arts education, and examine the shortcomings of using this phrase, that will actually, it will motivate us to be more reflective in what we mean about a liberal arts education. I'll conclude my short presentation not by offering a definition of a liberal arts education. That may be something we have to do later or during the panel discussion, but I will at least tell you what it's not. Okay? The first observation to make is I've obviously got a problem with this term well-rounded. That's obvious, but I think we need to also point out just how commonplace this term really is. I was joking with the panelists that if I had a dime for every time I heard a liberal arts education described to me as a well-rounded education, I would be a very rich man indeed. I'll just leave it at that. Every semester I teach a world history survey, and every semester in that world history survey I teach the history of the Italian Renaissance and of Renaissance humanism. And in connection with that course theme, I always offer the opportunity for students to reflect upon the really sort of interesting and compelling, fascinating connections between Renaissance humanism from 500 years ago and a liberal arts education at Marian today. And so what I ask students is to reflect upon those connections and how we owe so much to the Italian humanists from 500 years ago. And during that assignment, during that class discussion, I always ask students, well, what does a liberal arts education mean to you and how do you define it? Time after time, semester after semester, if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times, is that students describe a liberal arts education as well-rounded. I think the same applies to faculty, staff, and administration at this university. It is a very, very common phrase to use. And I'll also notice that I've been hearing lots and lots of radio ads for Marian University on local radio stations recently, and I think in at least one of them, I think I heard it, I heard the phrase well-rounded used to describe a liberal arts education at Marian University. So it means to me, at least, that we're trying to make an appeal to a broader topic by using this term, well-rounded. So what's the problem with the phrase? Why do I have a complaint about it? There's several things to point out. Number one is that I think this is a sort of a tired, worn-out, trite, cliched, hackneyed expression. In addition to that, I think in many, many cases that it's sort of an empty and useless phrase. In other words, it doesn't really mean anything. I think that when folks use this term, we use it in a way just as a sort of almost a verbal shorthand to signify something, but we're not exactly sure what that is. And the problem with doing that is that it limits reflection, and it limits dialogue. That as soon as someone uses the term, we all just make an assumption that he or she knows what they're talking about, and that's the end of the discussion. So that's problematic. There's a second problem, though, and I think this is actually a greater problem still, and that is when we describe a liberal arts education as being well-rounded, and I ask people to clarify what exactly that means, if it means anything. It usually means that a well-rounded education requires you to take one or two courses in lots of different disciplines. In other words, the goal of liberal arts education to make you well-rounded means that you know a little bit about a lot of stuff. And I think that's problematic to describe a liberal arts education in that way. One is I think it suggests that a liberal arts education is just sort of about content. That liberal arts disciplines and liberal arts instructors are really just interested in imparting a little bit of content in our courses, and then students are supposed to take that information and no one's quite sure what to do with it. And that's actually not what liberal arts disciplines and liberal arts professors do. And also, I'll make the observation that if in my history course, if all I'm interested in doing is imparting a little bit of content knowledge, in other words, in my World Civ courses, if I just want students to memorize a few names, dates, and places, then I'll ask the question, what do you need PhDs doing that for? Really, what do you need me to do that for? You could train a monkey to do that. And you could pay that monkey with just a bunch of bananas once a month, and you'd get off a lot cheaper, okay? So I think there's some danger in using this phrase because it suggests that it's all about content. The other thing I'll point out about this idea of content and learning a little bit of stuff in a lot of different areas is that it suggests that a liberal arts education is accidental in its usefulness. That if it turns out to be useful, it's just through like fortunate sort of happenstance. That it's a good thing for you to know a little bit about a lot of stuff because you never know what life might bring you. And I sometimes refer to this as the Forrest Gump model of education. And we all know what Forrest Gump's mother told him, is that life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Life is full of surprises. So a liberal arts education is good to have because you never know what you're going to have to know, right? And the observations I'll make about this is that surely we're trying to do something much different than that here. Surely we're more deliberate and intentional in a liberal arts education than just sort of sending you out into the world with a little bit of content knowledge and, gosh, we hope it turns out to be useful at some point or another. The other argument I'll make about this is I'm not even sure that random bit of information, those factoids, names, dates, and places, are in fact all that useful. I forgot to start this. I'm sorry. It really is all that useful. I was just meeting with 9 400-level history students, and I asked them to describe a liberal arts education, and 7 of the 9 described it as a well-rounded education. I asked them, what is good about that? And I suggested, well, I guess you'd be a really good contestant on a trivia quiz show like Jeopardy, and they all actually were really enthusiastic about that. They all love Jeopardy. I also suggested that just knowing a little bit about a lot of stuff is good for making lively conversation at a cocktail party. That, you know, if you're there with a bunch of strangers, you can always have a conversation, right? I also suggested that it's good if you're ever stuck on like a cross-country airline flight where you're on that flight for 4 hours and you have a very chatty seatmate. You can carry that conversation for 4 hours because you can always just talk about something. And so let me just wrap up. I'll make the observation. I haven't told you what I think a liberal arts education is, but I'm really sure it's not a well-rounded education. And what I'll ask all of you to do moving forward in terms of a paradigm shift is as follows. Eliminate this phrase from any description that you give of a liberal arts education. And I think that if you do that deliberately, if you avoid using this phrase, it will actually motivate you to engage in more careful reflection. And you'll be able to describe or define or articulate a liberal arts education in more nuanced and complex ways. And I think if we want a paradigm shift, that's exactly what we want.
Hello, can you all hear me all right? I'm Professor Christina Kubasta. I teach in English here. I also try to be very active in our CMG program, which is our Cultural, Media, and Gender Studies minor. I have to apologize. I have no jokes prepared, and I'm not going to be very funny coming after Dr. Szromba because I'm not funny. But I wanted to talk about this idea of new paradigms in terms of being more intentional was a word that kept coming up in our conversations when we were planning this panel. And for me, that means being more articulate. And it means being more articulate, especially with students in the classroom. So what I'd like to talk about is some things I'm trying. I attended the pre-symposium panel last fall. Dr. Kalwaitis from Marian was on it along with a couple other panelists. And in listening, it occurred to me that I don't do a very good job explaining to students why I think this matters to me. So we can ask my students later if I'm doing this at all better, but I am actually making an attempt to do this semester. So I wanted to address a few ways I'm trying to do that in the classroom. And then I also wanted to talk about the idea of cultural studies as being a way to approach the idea of the liberal arts, perhaps using new approaches, new language to perhaps avoid the well-rounded, perhaps, and other buzzwords. So that's what I'd like to talk about. So first to classroom experiences. For me, again, demonstrating what we mean by a liberal arts education means being very intentional in the classroom, making that rationale directly to the students. Here's why I think English 112, Introduction to Literary Genres, could matter, should matter, may matter in your life. And in terms of life, I don't mean simply major, although we definitely talk about the connections there. I don't mean simply work, because that's only one facet of our lives. And I also talk about personal lives, because I think there are ways that we can make all of these things meaningful. I'm not defined solely by my area of study. I'm not defined solely by my occupation. I'm not defined solely by my personal life. And I think to privilege one over another actually sort of cuts off an important part of who we are. So in discussing this with students, I've done this a number of times in my English 112 class, which again is an introductory literature class, and asked students to interact with some of these ideas that I feel are important. Right on the first day of class, I offer a definition of literature, and that is that literature is writing that questions the dominant culture in some way. We return to that at numerous points during the semester, and then, spoiler alert for my students who are there from this class, on the last day we're going to discuss that again, and we're going to ask the students to identify which texts seem to most closely fit that definition, and which texts perhaps really didn't fit that definition at all, and I should reconsider whether I should include them in the syllabus for next year. Again, in English 112, we had a conversation where I asked students to come up with the reasons why they think they're taking that class. And we identified their majors and their areas of interest. And one student story told I actually found particularly meaningful, and I think it relates to something that one of the other panelists is going to discuss in a little bit. She was a nursing major, and she was talking about this book she'd read, this biography of, I believe it was a woman who was a breast cancer survivor. And she was talking about how much she enjoyed reading this, and how now when she thinks about her nursing career and what she might be doing with that degree in the future, that she remembers that woman's voice. So not just sort of the story, but that woman's voice and what she was thinking of and what were the interior conversations she was having while she was undergoing this experience. And I thought that that was, a really great example of how and why this idea of inhabiting a text or inhabiting a character or inhabiting a voice might be a way to encourage greater empathy. And that's just one example, but I think that's something that if we ask students explicitly to think, hey, what have you read? How could this be relevant? That perhaps more of those connections would be clearer. I also like the idea that it came from students, that I wasn't telling the student, here's why this matters, but rather it was occasioned by the student's own reflection. And I think that's, again, in terms of being a little more intentional with this, asking for those responses might be a way to make the idea of a liberal arts education more meaningful in the classroom. I think we can also choose, again, in literature, texts that do seem particularly meaningful to students if we're aware of what their majors are, what their interests are, what their experiences are. We could tailor our syllabi in a way to make that more meaningful. I think that would be a great option. Another thing I've started to try to do is to engage my students in creative exercises so that in the classroom they're not always writing a research paper or analysis of another text. And something I did try doing this semester, and I'm in the process of reading them now and quite enjoying them, is asking students to inhabit a different character from a short story we've read and retell the story from that character's position or point of view. And I had one really wonderful one that, again, I'm just in the middle of them, so I'll have more wonderful ones. We read Updike's A&P. I'm guessing some of us are familiar with that text or have been forced to read that text by me, perhaps, or someone else. It's a story of a young checker working in an A&P, a grocery store, and sort of observing the people who come in and having responses to them. And at one point, he refers to one of his coworkers who's a checker who is about the same age but is already married and has several children, whereas our narrator is a single young man. And he has a very particular response to some scantily clad women who come into the store, our narrator does. And so this student chose to inhabit the other checker, who was coming from a very different position, a very different point of view, where his concerns were about paying his mortgage and paying his bills and providing for his family, as opposed to our narrator who's able to make this grand gesture and quit his job but the other checker wouldn't have been able to do that without much more serious consequences. And I thought that it occasioned a completely different interpretation of the story, and a completely different reading of the story than I had actually ever read into it as an instructor. And so I thought that was another place where stressing this idea of the individual and subjective experiences and positionality, that could be a meaningful way to connect with some of the ideas that we do think is important in the liberal arts, especially within the humanities. And that's, I guess, my segue into cultural studies. Am I doing all right? Okay. Cultural studies, we have a new CMG minor here at Marian. It's a new program. We've been in existence for a few years. And those of us who are involved with the CMG minor like it for a number of reasons. One, it's taught primarily through electives, a number of different instructors from across the curriculum. So students get to see other instructors, their approaches to topic, perhaps get some inclination of the interdisciplinary nature of knowledge in itself just by the way it's delivered. Our department head, Dr. Kalwaitis, also likes to refer to cultural studies as the new liberal arts, and I'd like to kind of explain why he feels that way and what we mean by that. Cultural studies ask students, although I know this is a buzzword, to think critically about basic assumptions, and that is one of the goals of the liberal arts. There's a wonderful article about cultural studies in a business program written by Elizabeth Swanson Goldberg and Dana Greenberg, and they write of this connection between cultural studies and the liberal arts, and they say that students are challenged in the liberal arts to integrate the idea of truth, the ways in which phenomena taken for true or universal belief systems or cultural practices are actually ideologically, institutionally, or culturally determined. Cultural studies as a discipline is often misunderstood. It's often thought to be, the development of sort of a multicultural perspective. That's not what we within the program mean by cultural studies. What we mean is that a student from within their own situatedness, so from within their own viewpoint or within their own culture or framework, that they can begin to ask questions about the I. And I think most of us would agree that liberal arts takes on important questions, and one of those questions is, who am I? Cultural studies allows a way to deal with that question from an individual student's experiences and position and point of view, as opposed to sort of standing outside a system and looking in. Goldberg and Greenberg continue that this idea of action, of finding agency within one's cultural context by making visible the structures of power and dominance operating within that context, is another arena that connects liberal arts to other disciplines that may focus on professional competencies or preparing the individual for the world of work. I attempt to incorporate some of these ideas about cultural studies, not just in my cultural studies class, but in my core classes as well. I teach a number of sections of English 106, which is our research writing and argumentation and research writing. Okay. And so I introduce students to the idea of a cultural artifact, what a cultural artifact is, how it reveals cultural information such as the culture's values and fears. They read a fairy tale in that method. Their second paper, they read a piece of language or look at a piece of language to figure out sort of what it reveals about our own culture and the way we use that word. And I've had a number of really wonderful experiences with that and a number of really wonderful student papers. One I got this semester that I just wanted to share. I think the student started writing the paper just with some questions, noticing the ways in which he and his peers use language. And by the end of the paper was able to come to really sort of a larger conclusion about the way certain types of language create gaps between people. And he was looking at the slang we use to describe sexual experiences in general. And that the use of that language not only sort of acknowledges that those gaps exist, but also perhaps reinforces those gaps and makes them larger. And again, it was just through looking at a piece of language that this somewhat, I think, really interesting idea came about. And so that's a way that I try to, I guess, walk the walk and not just talk the talk in terms of some of my classes. I also think that in terms of this idea of new paradigms, that we as instructors and as an institution and all of us as a community need to recognize the value of simply struggling towards something and struggling towards an idea as opposed to perhaps always being focused on the exact product. And that's where I'd like to respond to Dr. Murray's address last night. I'm assuming there were some of us who were here last night. One of the things that occurred to me listening to Charles Murray was that his criticism seemed to be not necessarily of a liberal arts education per se, but rather a liberal arts education that had some flaws or that didn't work. And rather than sort of scrap that system or question whether that system should exist, I think one of the things we could do here at Marian is we could acknowledge some of the things that we're doing well and then work on some of the things that perhaps aren't working as well. And I was really gratified last night when the first question to our speaker was a student who stood up and said, you've talked about this idea that the faculty-student relationship isn't important anymore, isn't as important as it used to be. And the student who stood up said, I disagree. I have had aha moments, and I've had them through interactions with my professors here because I have a real relationship. I think he mentioned driving back from a conference and listening to the Doobie Brothers. It really sounded like a great story. But I was really pleased that the Doobie Brothers. No. But I think that idea that one of the things that we are able to do here at Marian is have those real relationships with students where we can recognize struggling towards something and respond to it in a meaningful way is really something we should be very proud of. I also think that there are a few other programs that sort of embed the structural idea of this interdisciplinary knowledge. And again, I would say I think cultural media and gender studies is attempting to do that. I would also say honors program in terms of, team-taught interdisciplinary classes, trying to make visible those connections between different areas of knowledge, different disciplines, different faculty teaching styles as well. What we could do to respond perhaps to some of Dr. Murray's criticisms is, continue to build on some of those things that are going well and recognize sort of what works in terms of the Marian community and how we can improve upon that. And just that idea that we are always thinking about how to improve our teaching, how to improve the classroom, how to make these things more visible to students, more meaningful in students' lives. This academic symposium addressing that question is a struggling towards that should be recognized just for the struggling towards, just for the quest of that, even if we don't necessarily always have the concrete proof that we're there, I guess. That's it.
I'm Abbey Rosen. It's on. I'm in the chemistry program and also co-director of the honors program with Dr. Szromba. And so thank you, Christina, for saying that the honors program is a model that we should be moving towards that will help us better address some of what Dr. Murray said last night. So thank you. I'm going to begin first by talking a bit about science, and then I'll move more into humanities and liberal arts altogether. In my research for today's panel, I found a quote from a 1989 report by the Sigma Z. It's a scientific research society, and it addresses what I think science is all about. Science is a process of investigating phenomena, physical, biological, behavioral, social, economic, and political phenomena. That sounds much broader than my chemistry course. But anyone who's taken my chemistry course knows that's what we talk about. Science is here to help all of us better understand the world around us. And that is, well, why is the sky blue? That's why the Etch-a-Sketch comment. It is, why the housing bubble? Why is the housing bubble similar to the education bubble that was proposed last night? Science gives us a way to work through these issues, to address them, to make an observation, to ask, well, why? What's going on? To make a hypothesis, then test it. And, there are different ways of testing. They don't all have to be experiments in the lab. And then to draw conclusions. And science and the liberal arts education, that's what we're here to help you develop, is the ability to make conclusions based on logical evidence. So that's, to me, the crux of what we're supposed to be doing in the liberal arts with science. And for any course to be entered into the Marian University liberal arts core curriculum, it has to, any science course, it has to address the scientific method. So hopefully all of you who have taken science from us have seen the scientific method. Is that true, relatively? Okay. So you should be seeing that. You should be getting familiar with that. In my science classes, and hopefully in my colleagues' science classes, we're doing more than just trying to deliver content, as Dr. Szromba was talking about. That idea that we're not just here to deliver content to you. We're not going to crack your skulls open, pour in information, shake it up, and send you home. In fact, I hope none of us do that. In our science classes and in our other classes, I hope you're getting to play with the ideas and to make them concrete within your own context. A few weeks ago in my chemistry course, to make something a little more concrete, we were talking about evaporation. So I went in my stockroom and I grabbed a bunch of chemicals, brought them back to the classroom, and I poured them out on the benchtop. Acetone, ethanol, water. We just let them sit to see what evaporation looked like, to be able to test and to observe and make our own hypotheses, to play with the science, and then to draw some conclusions. And so I think that idea of making us ask questions, to play with the material that we're trying to help you learn, will address some of Dr. Murray's concerns. Because Dr. Murray last night said that he wants us as educators to investigate how and why people dig deeper into subjects. To me, one of the best ways to get you to dig deeper is to give you something to observe or something to play with, and then start to ask those questions. And so I think we do that pretty well at Marian. This idea of giving you experiences for your education. I think in our radio ads it says 90-something% of our students have real experience. Is that the right number? I think 90%. And that includes your clinicals if you're nursing or rad tech. That includes the internships within business. That includes the research projects within science. That includes going to Sigma Tau Delta and presenting at a literature conference. So we're giving you that on-the-job training within the liberal arts setting. So I think Marian actually does address some of Dr. Murray's issues last night. And so if we want to think about this paradigm shift, we need to acknowledge that science and humanities aren't two warring factions, that we're all part of the liberal arts, and that you can't have science without the humanities. Because, for instance, when AIDS was first coming into our knowledge in the 80s, it was a social issue. There was cultural issues. There was gender issues when AIDS was coming about. The scientists were very busy working, trying to figure out what was causing the illness. But then we also had other issues to that disease that had to be addressed. The scientists can't solve the problems alone. We can't exist in a vacuum. And so I need my colleagues at the table to help me explain my science and to put it into context that makes it relevant to you. And so science and humanities are together in the liberal arts and should be taught that way. And that's part of what the honors program does. I'm going to tout the honors program a little bit. Some of my best experiences at Marian have been working with colleagues on the honors program. Jennifer Krieger and I taught together last fall of 10, Molecules of Emotion, a class that brought together chemistry and psychology. Yes, two sciences, but a hard science, physical science, and a social science. I hate the word hard science. I think it does not do justice to psychology. But that melding of the different disciplines so students can see both the scientific question, but then also those other questions that we need to address, the cultural, the mental health issues. Christina and I hopefully will be teaching together. Some cultural, maybe, science. But the honors program wants our students to see issues from multiple perspectives. And I think anytime I can get a science class or a science instructor to pair up with somebody from humanities, that makes for a more enriching experience. Additionally, Dr. Szromba and I are working to make the honors program more deliberate in having you experience knowledge. For instance, honors students, we are proposing that in a year from now, Professor Krieger will hopefully teach a course that has you examine a social issue and has you examine your assumptions related to that social issue. And then we actually send you out to study it. We have you experience it. That's playing with the same knowledge that we've been teaching you for 8 weeks, but you get out, you experience it, you make it real, you make it your own. And then you come back and you go, oh my God, I was so wrong about all of that. Or you come back and say, yeah, I got it all. I knew what I was talking about before I left. I doubt it. But the honors program is looking for more of these short-term, not necessarily study abroad, but studying experiences off campus to get you involved with the community, to get you involved in learning your knowledge, in learning the material. The honors program would also like to see you study abroad, and not just honors students. We'd like to see that increase across campus, and that's to increase your global perspectives. Something that is important in liberal arts education. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to address just a couple of things from Dr. Murray last night. After teaching Molecules of Emotion with Professor Krieger, I learned a lot about psychology, and also working with Jen, I've learned a lot about student maturation. And last night, Dr. Murray proposed that students in college do not mature. That all we do is prolong your adolescence. It bothered me, and I had to reflect upon it some more to really figure out why it bothered me. He said that 19-year-old soldiers are more mature than 19-year-old college students. And apparently this is a quote, not necessarily from Dr. Murray, but from another source. I would say a 19-year-old is a 19-year-old is a 19-year-old. The physical, and you guys know this from if you've seen me before, the physical closing of your frontal lobe is the same in a 19-year-old who is sitting here in this room today versus a 19-year-old who's over in Afghanistan. Your frontal lobe hasn't fully connected. Physically, we know that. Scientifically, we know that. And so you're still making decisions in about the same manner. And he also said last night, part of showing maturation was showing that you didn't binge drink, that you didn't pick up these awful addictions. I love my friends who serve in the military, and I thank them for their service. However, I also know many of them come home addicted to drugs and to cigarettes, but much more so than when they left. And so I don't believe that a 19-year-old soldier is any more mature than a 19-year-old student. I think they've just had different experiences. And so I really just need to say that I disagree with that, and scientifically we know it not to be true. And then the other thing I want to build off of is last night he was talking about this idea that everyone should be exposed to the liberal arts in K through 12. Awesome idea, right? Help you, before you get here, start to explore different disciplines, different jobs. I think that's a good idea. However, when you get here, we need to help you continue that. I don't think it should stop at 12, after 12th grade. I think that should continue on a college campus where you can have those interactions with faculty and be driven in a way, in a manner. And that is part of what we do within the honors program and at Marian University. So I think I'm going to end there. Let Jodi have it.
Thank you, everybody. I am Professor Jodi Wagner-Angell in the English department, and I think what I'll talk about a little bit today is a little bit more English-based, and then how we can use the liberal arts and how we can make that a little bit more evident to our students and in our classrooms as well. We all agree, I think, that the debate is not whether a liberal arts education or a liberal arts major is useful or not, but rather how can we make that usefulness and practicality a little bit more explicit in everything we do. I think we need to stress in every class we teach, every project for students, every project that you embark on, to understand the vital skills that you're using and make connections. When I was preparing for this panel, it's amazing the different things that I experienced this last month and all the connections that were being made. And I think that goes along with the cross-disciplinary, the co-teaching, all that kind of stuff. I took some English majors to the Sigma Tau Delta Conference, which is the International English Honor Society. It was in New Orleans, and it was a fabulous conference. And I sat on one of the panels there. It was a round table much like this one that was asking people to think about the value of English and the humanities in schools. And so it was great how everything was being connected. And then also at that conference, it got me thinking about how I can make literature very meaningful to my students. And one of the fabulous poets that was speaking there, her name is Natasha Trethewey. She just beautifully said that literature teaches empathy better than anything else. And I think that is something that we need to remember as how we can I can get my literature students to think about that, to put themselves in somebody else's shoes and to understand what makes them tick and to understand a different culture or a different time period. And I see that happening in both my British literature class this semester and my drama class. We went to Kill a Mockingbird at the Milwaukee Rep, and that was a beautiful it was a beautiful play. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, but in the play there's Jean Louise, who's the adult version of Scout, and she narrates the story along with everybody and as the play is going on. She narrates the story, and there's like this old cranky neighbor lady, and Jem and Scout throw things at her door, and it was really interesting how their father Atticus is teaching them understand what it's like to be her. Try to understand what it's like to be here. And the directors did such a beautiful job making that evident, because the narrator Jean Louise, she actually would kind of change her costume a little bit, grab a cane and put a cape on and become that old lady. So it was like her virtually putting herself in somebody else's shoes as she was looking back on the story. And if we can do that somehow in our classes, like having people take on roles of people that they're reading, or like cultures or things like that, we can make that more meaningful to our students. And for you students out there in those literature classes, just try to do that. Put yourself in your shoes, on somebody else's shoes, and that's something that I think would be really helpful. Another thing with English that has come up recently, another article that I've read, and again, these connections, it's just crazy how they're all happening all within a couple weeks of each other. There was an article written in Inside Higher Ed. It was by John Duffy. It's called an essay on the value of the first-year writing course. And John Duffy talks about, and he responds to the increasing occurrences of very hateful, inconsiderate discourse that is occurring in our political world, and how people are attacking each other, not based on their rational arguments, but on just attacking them and using very polarizing terms. He gives the example and uses the example of Rush Limbaugh's recent controversy. I won't go into that, but he writes that our universities need to make evident how we can avoid things like that. And he says that the first-year writing course, so English 106, all of you in that, how the first-year writing course asks students to make a claim, provide solid evidence, provide some counter-arguments, and to really get to know the audience that the person is writing to, and to be able to be ethical and generous in creating those arguments. And so that's something that I think that I really want to make explicit to anybody in my classes. I will end that some of the practical applications, and again, some of these ideas I heard at the conference that I went to, that panel, evaluating or reimagining and reawakening the value of English in the humanities. The cross-disciplinary is something that we've always tried to do, and I think if we do more of it, that would be wonderful. Students who major in the liberal arts or in any liberal arts, or sometimes in English, they always wonder, well, what am I going to do? What kind of career am I going to have? And the common response in English, at least, is you can do anything. You can do anything you want because you can communicate and you can write well. Well, us telling people that you can do anything doesn't really tell them anything, because it's not specific. And as an English instructor, I harp on people to be specific, give some examples, and I'm going to ask that we do that for our students and make that more explicit as well. We need to hold ourselves accountable. We have to, if we claim that a liberal arts education or a liberal arts major is going to be beneficial to your lives, your career, personal, or your career-wise, then we have to help supply that evidence. And so that's my challenge to us as well. A couple last things that I thought were really fascinating. Doing some more job shadowing and some internships might be helpful. I know that there are tons of job shadowing internships in other disciplines. English, I know we need to probably work on that. And it might be a good idea to touch base with our alumni, bring them in, have them touch base with our current students, see how their liberal arts degree has helped them out in their careers, and to be able to do that. Just to incorporate that a little bit more. It is interesting, I noticed at Mount Mary University in Milwaukee, I met a nice professor there at the same panel, and she said that they require all their English majors to take an internship. It's not an option, it's a requirement. And that's something that really intrigued me, and thinking about how we can maybe formulate stuff like that. So that's all I have. And so I guess we'll open it up to questions or comments.
I actually suggested to Cheryl that this group does not need a moderator, but she's determined now that she has me here, I'm not going to get off. I do feel, to quote Charles Schulz, this is the Peanuts artist, who this isn't the exact wording, but it was Charlie Brown and Linus are lying on their backs watching the clouds go over, and Charlie Brown says to Linus, "What do you see in the clouds?" And Linus said, "I see, Schopenhauer's head outlined, and I see a representation of the Platonic forms." And then Charlie Brown said, "I was going to say I saw a horsey and a doggy, but I changed my mind." So you don't need a moderator, and I'm just in awe of clearly all the work you put in there. But nevertheless, Cheryl's not letting me off, so we'll take questions. I guess I'm standing so I can see anyway, and I'll just wave them over. It's sort of like landing an airplane. Anyone want to start off with a question or a comment or a suggestion? We're looking to the future of the liberal arts here at Marian. Wow. Talk about failures moderator. Yes. Our panel again.
Just to go back to Dr. Szromba's point about well-rounded, I had a student ask in a class last week, he said, "By the way, you also need to stop using the phrase critical thinking." And his argument was that had also become a bit shop-worn and didn't really mean anything, and you hear it so many times as students that it's gone, and that we're actually not communicating when we use that language. And I don't know if any perhaps students have thoughts on that, or if the panelists would like to respond to that idea. I thought it was a really great point, because I know I'm guilty of just putting that phrase in and thinking it's adequate, and as Dr. Szromba suggested with well-rounded, it's not adequate.
Is that true, students? Getting one head shake.
Yeah, there's
yes
some
here.
nods.
Go ahead. No. They're getting mics. Maybe a helpful suggestion might be, if this phrase has lost, if these words have lost their meaning, what is the alternative? So I can't say this, but if I were going to say that, I would say use some critical thinking and use your communication skills. Remember, I'm the one who said there are 4 C's: communication, critical thinking, creativity, and Doug added character as the four C's for the liberal arts. Well, let's communicate and critically think of an alternative to critical thinking.
I think we have begun to address that, actually.
Good.
Last spring, Dr. Smith and I led the faculty in a redefinition of critical thinking on campus. We redefined our learning outcomes for the idea of critical thinking, and it goes back to what Dr. Klein was saying. One of our new indicators, to know that you guys are actually, that you and we are practicing critical thinking, is asking questions. One of our four indicators is your ability to ask those deeper questions that broaden the knowledge at hand. Additionally, we're looking for students, as always, to make logical, well-supported conclusions. Bless you. And so actually, I've stopped using critical thinking. Well, okay, not entirely. But the words I use less and less during my chemistry course because it freaks my students out. And so I talk about making logical, supported conclusions. Just drop CT and talk about making conclusions. But also, we want you to evaluate. So it's evaluate, draw conclusions, ask questions, and give implications. Those are our new indicators. And so if we use those words, the actions of critical thinking, hopefully you'll get less tired of them and it will be more meaningful, because critical thinking is quite nebulous. But giving you specific actions to work towards, I think, is more manageable.
Yes. We have Mike here.
Well, I think I'll use my outdoor voice. What I'm considering, and it's relative to healthcare, because it's becoming a very common phrase also, is an idea that there needs to be more interdisciplinary activities as part of going forward in liberal arts. Is that correct? So that we should be dealing more with
You field it, and then I'll take it from there. I'm serious. You're the best person to address this, and then I'd like to follow up.
Okay, to argue with me. So I'm sorry, your question is that designing interdisciplinary would be a...
Talk about content, and I guess I'm looking at a structure now that says what I hear is that there's more of a focus than it is on healthcare itself now to be more interdisciplinary, that you're not having just one subject here and try to investigate it, but also investigate it from 2 or 3 different disciplinary perspectives.
Sure, and I have to say, the healthcare context, isn't something that I'm familiar with. But simply the notion that whenever we're doing a particular task or performing a particular job or interacting with an individual or a process or something, that there's never simply one way to do that, and that one way to do that isn't sort of necessarily, the best or the most complete way to do. I mean, I just think that idea, that thinking about different types of knowledge, different ways of enacting that knowledge, different ways of interacting with and perhaps questioning that knowledge, that just sort of as a basic idea, I would think that would be incredibly useful in any context. Because again, we have many selves. We don't just have one self. We don't just have one job. We don't just have one way of interacting with the world. And so an approach that acknowledges sort of that multiplicity of selves and different ways of approaching anything, to me seems just a no-brainer good thing. And now Dr. Szromba is going to argue.
No, not necessarily. My lone concern about this emphasis on interdisciplinarity is that interdisciplinarity for the sake of interdisciplinarity, we should be careful of doing that. We need to be really deliberate in this process of offering courses and programs of study that are interdisciplinary, and make sure that we're setting out with a specific goal in mind. And to me, at least, the goal of interdisciplinary studies is that we build more knowledge. We create a greater sort of synthesis by taking knowledge from one discipline and another, and finding ways how these two disciplines inform one another. That's not easy to do, right? This term I'm teaching an interdisciplinary class with Professor Gross, sociology and history. And I've noticed it's been a real struggle with students in some ways for them to better understand how the two disciplines inform one another and how we build more knowledge through the two disciplines informing one another. And I'll readily admit there have been times when I've struggled with that. So it's not just an easy solution to say, well, we're going to be more interdisciplinary. We have to do it in a more, we have to just at least do it in a very reflective and thoughtful and careful way. The other thing I'd argue is that I'm a historian and I'm also a bit of a traditionalist. And I see nothing wrong with maintaining disciplines. It's too often the case, and here's another word I'd actually like to eliminate at the university, and that is siloing. I'm not the only one. Professor Schimpf is a big one on siloing. That we use this term siloing in regards to disciplines to signify something that's bad, and I'm not exactly sure what that means. Disciplines are disciplines for good reasons. We have specific goals. We have specific methodologies. We have specific ways of thinking. We have specific subject matter that we study. And if that means that I'd like to teach history in history classes, well, then call me a siloist. But I don't see anything wrong with it. And it's too often the case we throw this word around, siloing, without defining what exactly we mean. And it's too often the case it just means something bad, but we don't know why.
I was just going to add one thing that's sort of related to the interdisciplinary and the connections that I was referring to a little bit more. I remember when I was in college and graduate school, some of the most exciting moments where you saw connections between like classes that didn't seem related at all, and you make those connections on your own. And so a lot of times I try to ask students, okay, so how does this connect with whatever reading? How can that connect with something in your major or just outside of your life? And so even just asking those questions and to get students to think about those connections as well is helpful and meaningful too.
Matt, I have a question for you.
Yes.
You want to teach history and history, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
often.
How do you
yes.
do that? Are you making them memorize dates? What is history in history here at Marian?
Well, I mean, I've got some students here. Maybe they'd like to take over. No? No? Okay. Well, I mean, I think what we do in our history courses is something. It's not to say that we don't have students memorize names, dates, and places. It would be a mistake for me to make that claim. Because names, dates, and places, people's events, institutions, these things are inherent to the discipline. But what we're more interested in doing is teaching how historians think, getting students to engage in historical thinking by using the historical mind. What exactly does that mean? That maybe doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of folks. It means that what we ask students to do is to evaluate people, places, society, civilization in the context of their history. And to reinforce this idea among students and encourage them to engage in their own analysis and interpretation to understand that people think, feel, and do things in the context of their history. And the mistake that we often make as students of history is that we just describe our own values, our own ideas, our own beliefs to peoples in the past. And that's what we try not to teach in history. Dr. Gross, do you have anything to add to this? So, I guess one easy way of summarizing what I do in my history courses is that my courses are as much about process as they are about content. I've avoided the word critical thinking. The process of historical inquiry, as there's much about that as content.
Thank you for doing what I thought you were going to do, and say that.
No, let her, please. This is germane.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Matt, for saying that you teach how historians think. That was one thing I don't think any of us really addressed today during our panel, was that taking a class in chemistry helps you to see the world from the viewpoint of a chemist and how we go about addressing issues. Taking a class with Jodi helps you look at literature and writing from her perspective, so you leave with more of an appreciation of that. It also helps you prepare to address these problems in multiple perspectives. And so, Matt, thank you for going there, because that's what I was looking for. I would agree that we're not here to shove facts down their throat, and that we're here to help them think within our disciplines.
Now, go ahead.
I just had a question here. I understand what you're saying about interdisciplinary study. It makes a lot of sense to me as well. But the idea of looking at something from multiple perspectives, though, is maybe this is what you're talking about, Matt. Like, for example, I was thinking of the healthcare issue, and I was thinking about an article that you just gave me recently, and the guy that wrote the article, Sandel, I think his name is, said that there's a big difference between having a market economy and a market society. And he said a market economy is great. It's a good thing to have and so on. But a market society, in his opinion, is not such a great thing to have because it dictates all, it just throws all kinds of values just askew and it distorts all kinds of things, that are not in the best interest of the greater good. So my question is, or sort of, question I guess, is wouldn't an interdisciplinary approach to healthcare, for example, be beneficial in the sense that you wouldn't just get the perspective of the economists who don't really, who aren't really that concerned about the greater good. They're concerned about making profit, as they should be, and businesses are concerned about making profit. But businesses in a sense, especially, in the corporate mind, in the, corporate way of thinking, are not in the habit of, and maybe they shouldn't be, of thinking of the greater good. So we need other perspectives to inform those perspectives and temper them and, somehow integrate them together so that the greater good is taken into consideration, not just turning everything into a commodity that can be used to make a profit. I was just thinking that might be a point of focus for a more multi-perspective.
Yeah. I guess what I was encouraging, that if we're going to teach interdisciplinary courses and regard the education here at Marian as being interdisciplinary, I think we need to set out with a plan, right? And not just think that these things, well, let me put it to you this way, and I'm not sure if this phrase works, but like the fruitfulness of that interdisciplinary exchange, whether that just happens in an organic, we can't just expect it to happen in an organic way, that it's going to come entirely of itself. There needs to be a plan, and there needs to be really sort of deliberate reflection on how that's going to happen. Let me also just say this, is that as co-director of the honors program, Abbey and I, we're constantly making faculty marriages around campus. We're playing matchmaker all the time in terms of these interdisciplinary team-taught courses. And in reflecting on the courses that we've offered over time, some of them have been very successful, very happy, long-lasting marriages. We've never had a really bad breakup, but then again, I'm not sure that we had some relationships that were all that good. And so we just need to be careful. Just gluing two disciplines together and expecting something good to happen isn't going to do it. Okay, yeah. Okay. I was going to say something else.
You'll be next.
My name is Eric Pamper, and I'm a junior here at Marian University. It's my second semester here. I transferred from UW-Fond du Lac after graduating there with my associate's degree in studying sports management here. My question for you today, first I'd like to start by saying the phrase, knowledge is power. I don't like this phrase. I disagree with it. I believe knowledge applied is power. So my question is, after 4 years of getting a degree, there's a lot of knowledge sitting up in your brain. How can higher education implement an educational system focused on applying that action, applying action gained by that knowledge?
Can you repeat that last part?
Yeah. How can higher education implement an educational system focused on action-based learning, applying knowledge that is gained?
One way to do that is like seeking out as many internships and making connections with outside job experience sources and trying to see those connections as well. And if that's asking like maybe your advisor or something to say, hey, I really would like to pursue this or get an internship, that might be a real practical way to do that and get the at least when you're half in school and half still in the workforce, that might be a really great way to see that application. So that's one possible way. I don't know if any other thoughts.
Just regarding that, we were doing some housekeeping and some administrative things earlier this year and realized that most of the humanities departments actually have internships in the course catalog that are often not used. And as Dr. Wagner-Angell mentioned, us thinking about ways to do that and ways to implement that and ways to get students engaged within some of those departments where it might not seem the most perfect fit is a good idea. But also, students can think of ways that they would like to try something new out, or, approach your advisor or approach a professor about the option of doing this. It's worth noting that they're available actually in a lot of places where we don't actually see them being as visible, and that we could, do more of that, I guess.
One outside of the classroom experience that you could do specifically for business is actually SIFE, Students in Free Enterprise. Students in Free Enterprise is open to students in any major, actually, and I think there's a biology major currently as president. But SIFE is an opportunity for students to come up with an idea, put it into action, and carry it out. So, that would be a way to take your knowledge at any level, as a freshman, sophomore, or so on, and try it out. So I think SIFE would actually be a great co-curricular way to do that.
I might have interpreted your question a little differently, in that you seem to be asking, how can I take what I learn here and apply it in a professional world or in my life in general? Is that kind of what you're driving at?
More like right away in the classroom.
Right away in the classroom. Okay. I'm going to give you the answer that I think is really strong, but it's probably going to be very unsatisfactory to you. And that is that you're already doing what you need to do. In that one of the goals of a liberal arts education is that you learn how to learn. Now, I've often made this argument to students, and they sort of react in the following way. What do you mean, learn how to learn? I already know how to learn. And that's true of all of us. And none of us would function in any sort of basic way if we didn't know how to learn. But to learn in very sophisticated ways is part of the liberal arts education. And so in the future, one of the skills that you will have when you leave here, you said your sports rec management, you'll have lots of knowledge to apply for a job. But one of the most important things that you'll know how to do is learn how to learn. And that's important because you can be your own teacher in the future.
He's been trying.
Oh, which one?
Blue shirt.
My name is Chad Langley. I'm a junior sport and rec major here. And my question is, do you think a liberal arts education can actually hurt your chance of getting a job? And I'm asking that because right now my GPA is probably like a 2.8. But if you would look at my sport and rec classes and just my business classes, it would probably be over a 3.0. So the history classes I'm taking, philosophy, science, stuff like that, which will most likely have nothing to do with my future job, is bringing my GPA down under 3.0, which, in my opinion, can actually hurt your chance of getting a job. So I was just wondering your guys' opinion on that.
You said your sports rec management. What are your aspirations? What do you want to sort of work toward in terms of what would be your dream job in? Okay. Will you have to think in that job? Yeah. Will you have to communicate both orally and in writing in very effective ways to be a good baseball coach? Yeah. Will you encounter persons from diverse backgrounds and from different cultural traditions, religious traditions, people with entirely different ideas than your own as a baseball coach? Then I would say everything that you're learning in your philosophy, in your history, and in your English is absolutely applicable to your job, your dream job as a baseball coach. Because each of these courses address exactly those things. And those are skills that you're going to have to be successful as a baseball coach.
Did you see the movie Moneyball? You think I'm joking, but I'm not really joking. I mean, in Moneyball, it was an economics major from what prestigious university was he from? I don't remember. But it was an economics major who totally changed the way the Oakland A's ran their baseball team and helped a team that could not afford even a fraction of what the Yankees had turned them into a team that almost made it to the World Series. And so outside of sports rec management, I think the liberal arts will be useful for your future career.
I was just going to say, I understand your question and your concern because it's one particular measure of your success as a student, and it's one that seems perhaps most visible, right, or that would be looked at in the future. I would say that it's only one particular measure, and it in no way encompasses you as a student and all you've done and all of your interests. And I think that often when we talk about the liberal arts and how useful are they or how not useful are they or where are we going to see them, we're looking for some sort of that sort of tangible moment, some tangible proof. Here's where I'm going to use this. This is exactly what I'm going to do. And I guess I would say that not everything is that explicit and not everything is that tangible. Your success in your job is one type of success. It's not the only thing that defines you as a human being. Your GPA is one particular way of measuring your skill as a student. I know it's an important one, and it's no comfort, right, when looking at it and thinking this. But it is only one way of looking at your at yourself as a student. Your other experiences and your they all matter too. Perhaps they're not as visible in certain contexts, but they all matter too. And there are ways in which those will benefit you, even if they're not sort of immediately visible looking at that number.
I'd like to have just a point of from the casual observer who would say that the word liberal arts to the people out there sometimes is misinterpreted to think that it's liberal in contradistinction to conservative. And you can see how this could happen. And I think it's basically our fault for not making that very, very clear, that being a liberal arts does not necessarily mean that you're being led down the path of liberalism. Now, secondly, I remember my blessed father, who used to say, in his opinion, a person who was educated would be singled out by the way he or she spoke, their demeanor, their ability to carry on a conversation, but also in the way that they would be able to think. And maybe I'm a little bit of anachronistic, but I still think that we should be able to single out a person who has received a liberal arts education by the demeanor that that person has, by the way they speak. For example, I'm still of the opinion that people who graduate from university should have proper grammar, use the past participle correctly. I really am very concerned about that because I hear some of my very good colleagues once in a while misuse the English language. Now, my final point is I sometimes in my long life have made the observation that youth, like education, is wasted on the young. And I think that now that I'm in education, since I'm an adjunct professor here at this university, I think our job is to encourage those young persons to be able to do all those things that were pointed out, the 4 or 5 characteristics of a liberal arts education. But basically, I think the word I'm looking for is extrapolation. In history, for example, which is one of my favorite topics, in English, which is also one of my favorite topics, in language, in philosophy, which I'm now in my late age, I'm finally discovering the beauty of it. Anyway, that's my opinion. Thank you.
I think if I could drop in there too, as someone who deals with a lot of different constituencies outside of higher education, there is a misunderstanding of what the liberal and liberal arts means. And it's easy, I think, for people on the inside to say, well, they're wrong or they're ignorant. But I think we have to remember we are educators. And to explain what we're about is part of our calling. And liberal arts and the word liberty actually have the same root. And the reason we have embraced liberal arts is it frees us as individuals, because with that approach to learning, you are free from cheap political slogans, from false advertising, from even your own faculty. If they're saying something ridiculous, you can challenge it. You are free individual. That's where liberal arts comes from. And I think your point is a good one, because I felt many times, well, for heaven's sakes, what a bozo who even thinks that. But that's the wrong response. So I appreciate you bringing it up. Yes.
Yes, Michael Ketterhagen is my name. I want to respond a little bit to Eric's question about how to make the learning really applicable, present, and really actively involved in the life. And service learning is a very significant curricular approach. All of our, not any of you, I'm sad to say, but are involved in the service learning. But every discipline here at the university has service learning courses. And in those courses, they get people involved in actually applying what it is that the curricular concept is by going out and meeting people and meeting their needs or responding to their needs, especially if it's a socially effective and adjusted need. Like, for example, for me in one of my theology courses, I teach a course, Theology of Love, and I have the students begin to understand that love is really serving the welfare of another person. Now, how do you do that? You get them into St. Vincent de Paul Society. You get them into Broken Bread. You get them into serving meals for people. And then people come up to students. Even one student said on an evaluation, I never really realized that I could love someone whom I didn't know. And that, of course, is the height of Christian love from a theologian's perspective, loving everyone. So I think, though, that is a way, and I'd just like to add that to your comments. And I think and I encourage my colleagues to think seriously about getting service learning as a curricular mode of operation, a curricular tool, a pedagogical tool, an andragogical tool, whatever other word you want to use for it, into the curriculum. And it will enliven the curriculum even more so than an internship. An internship brings you, that student is separate from us. When they're out in the internship world, we have to rely on, not that it's bad, but we have to rely on another teacher, the supervisor out there. But we can really make a real close contact if we involve and incorporate service learning in the whole process.
About 5 minutes left, so now's your chance. There, back there.
I'd like to just mention something about the interdisciplinariness, and maybe it's more what Carl was talking about in terms of multiple perspectives. In my area, education, we draw heavily on many disciplines. Sociology has a lot to tell us. Political science has a lot to tell us about education. Philosophy, history. And without those disciplines, I think we would... Our discipline of education would not be that rich. Part of the problem is, though, that as educators, I don't think we listen sometimes to the political scientists, to the sociologists, to the philosopher. We're not asking those really deep questions that comes from those disciplines. We kind of go across the surface at times. And that's kind of where we are right now when we look at public education in the United States. We should be asking those questions that the philosophers ask. We should have the insights from history. We should look at political science and sociology as they tell us what's happening around us. We can't understand education, and nobody can change education without looking at that context. And that bigger context is all about the disciplines we were just talking about. Thank you.
Okay. No, anyone else? Panel, last words? There's always one more thing, before anyone graduates here. One last thing to tell them. Sum it all up? No? We're all exhausted. I'm going to turn it back over to the committee here.
Well, I would like for the audience to please give a hand to our panel for giving us Douglas Bennett is going to talk, and it's on your sheet there. And I would encourage you to come back. This has been will be fed into administration as part of the strategic planning process for the Marian Board. So again, I thank the panel for your input, and I would certainly encourage you to be here tonight and on Thursday to talk about where we go from here. Thank you.